Hello. It's December the 18th, and today we have a full moon in Gemini. This is a kind of a unique or a full moon that kind of stands out in one respect due to the fact that the previous lunations that we were having, the last time we had a new moon, it was a solar eclipse in Sagittarius. And prior to that, the last full moon that we had was a lunar eclipse in Taurus. So this is we're coming out of the recent eclipses, and we're having our first kind of lunation in the sign of Gemini that isn't a eclipse. And so it kind of marks the end of this 18-month phase where the nodes were in Sag and Gemini, and we were getting eclipses in those signs. And so there's a sort of a sense of moving on. Um, it has been pointed out by other astrologers that I follow that this full moon might be a bit more jolly compared to some of the heavy things that we've had going on, because it is getting the moon itself is getting a trine from Jupiter, and the sun is in a sextile position to Jupiter. However, my personal subjective experience of this transit hasn't really felt all that jolly. I mean, I have moods that change day by day, but for me, the overall trend has not been, one of festive holiday cheer, I must say. I mean, I do notice though that like sometimes when I do these videos, like the process of recording a video, I don't know why, but it seems to like cheer me up to do a video. Um, but I don't know, maybe just the act of being creative or playing around with astrology or making something, doing something productive. Maybe there's something about that which picks me up a bit, but in general, I like when people talk about this being like a really positive, jolly kind of full moon. I haven't really been getting that. Um, so I don't really. Um, there have been areas though where I can see its relevance. Um, for example, when I think about the Sag and Gemini axis, I think about Sagittarius representing a kind of a spiritual, philosophical, that search for a higher truth, with it being a Jupiter ruled sign, and then Gemini being the kind of representing the thinking mind, which is in some ways related, but is the other side of the coin, because it's sort of like the dialectical, the kind of the chatterbox mind, which might, you know, not be so much about the big truth, but maybe more of like casual conversation, or little like little thing. I'm thinking like TikTok and stuff like that feels very Gemini to me. Um, and I don't know. I think also that there's, if you are into stuff like philosophy and spiritual truth, and you're in a position where you're trying to talk about it or communicate about it, you necessarily run into the polarity between these two signs, because Sagittarius is all about, well, like how you communicate that into words. How do you get that onto the page? How do you get that across? It's you're experiencing the tension between Jupiter and Mercury. Mercury standing for that kind of art of communication, the art of language and getting things across, whereas it can be a bit difficult sometimes to sort of squeeze some big revelation into something that can be easily communicated through language. And I'm a Sagittarius, and I consider myself to be a kind of a lover of wisdom and philosophy and all this kind of stuff. And around this time, I have found it to be a good time to get back into reading, as I would say, like highlighting that Sagittarius and Gemini axis there of the wisdom and the communication of it. And I mentioned this in my last video that I was reading Byung-Chul Han, a guy who is a philosophy professor in Berlin, and his I think that in some way even just the act of reading his books kind of represents this dynamic because um, I mean, I'm not like a educated, university educated person who studies philosophy or anything like that. I just kind of do it casually for my own fun, I guess you could say, or my own self interest. Um, there's a lot of stuff might seem kind of daunting because it seems really like thick and heavy. But I've been really into Byung-Chul Han because I mean the one that I just started reading, it's like it's not even really a book. It's like it's called the Burnout Society, but it's like a 50-page essay, and it's really like it's not very hard to get through these things at all. This is only like 50 pages. The last one I read was a bit longer. It was more like 100 pages. But there's something about I haven't looked at its chart or anything, but there's something about the having something philosophical in a kind of like a bite-sized, easily digestible format that seems to like hit both Jupiter and Mercury in its associations. Um, and on top of that, the stuff that I'm reading in like I like astrology because the archetypes are so universal that you can see this play of archetypes anywhere basically. And although Byung-Chul Han really, as far like it's not like trying to tie in astrology with like a mythical story and saying that it's like relevant because both of these things came from ancient Greece. In that there isn't really a lot of direct connection between a guy like Han and astrology. So I'm kind of making a bit of a leap to make the connection. But to me, that's basically, this is what I'm doing. I'm reading his books, and this is whatever. Anyways, I thought I'd share some of this stuff with you and kind of like play off this Gemini Sagittarius theme with what I'm reading here, at least how I interpret it, how I understand it. Um, so, I mean, this is a part where he has been talking about what happens when mankind is reduced to an animal laborans, or which is basically a kind of like a beast of burden, like you're just like a laboring beast. Um, Playing off of, I think it's Hannah or oh man, am I going to pronounce it right? Hannah Arendt making a statement. I'm kind of just jumping in the middle here. Anyways, what he says is, but the late modern animal laborans is anything but animalian. It is hyperactive and hyperneurotic. There must be another answer to why all human activities in late modernity are sinking to the level of mere laboring, and more still, why such hectic nervousness prevails. The modern loss of faith does not concern just God or the hereafter. It involves reality itself and makes human life radically fleeting. Life has never been as fleeting as it is today. Not just human life, but the world in general is becoming radically fleeting. Nothing promises duration or substance. Given this lack of being, nervousness and unease arise. Now, I have to also just throw in here that this book was written approximately a decade ago. So a lot of what I was getting when I was reading this book was that it seemed like it wasn't quite relevant to the current COVID situation. Like if you can imagine writing around 2011 or 2012 versus what it's like today. But I think there is, what I've noticed in the Gemini archetype is that there's something about Gemini which is has more of a fleeting quality. Now, like if you look at Gemini and Sagittarius, they're both mutable signs, right? So both mutable signs come at the end of a season, then and mark the transition into another season. So like Gemini season is like the end of spring, and it ends in the culmination of the summer solstice, and then Cancer season you've got summer. Sagittarius season is the end of the fall technically, and then you've got the winter kicking in with winter solstice. Um, so both of them represent a kind of a changing, impermanent kind of quality, um, and I think that in when you look at a full moon, like what's going on with this full moon, we've got we're kind of changing out of this phase where the lunar nodes had been in the sign. And we're also changing out of a phase where we've had Jupiter in the sign of Aquarius, and Jupiter is heading towards Pisces, where it's a lot better. It's a traditional ruler of Pisces, so it's got good dignity there, and it's the kind of like the good luck, generous, fortunate planet. So people are feeling pretty optimistic about Jupiter moving into Pisces shortly. However, what I get the sense though is that it's like it's kind of funny, right? Because I mentioned like I associate Gemini with like TikTok videos, that they're like little small short things that kind of get your attention, but before you know it, you're on to the next one, and you're not really investing a lot of time and attention into what you're doing. It's just like it just keeps moving, and like it's also Mercury is one of the fastest moving planets. It goes retrograde the most often, so Mercury is often associated with speed, quickness, and I think that I think it's fair to say that Mercury can be associated with a kind of like hyperactivity, um, and this kind of ties in with what Byung-Chul Han was saying, is that like we live in an age of anxiety because we're too centered around that kind of awareness, where we don't there's not a sense of something that is like to go back to what he was saying in his own words here, nothing promises duration or substance. So like in a world where there's a sense of everything's fleeting, everything's temporary, that there's a sense of like anxiety because there's no firm ground in which you can place your feet down on. There's nothing to sort of like anchor yourself into. And I would say, I mean, to me, it's like a kind of a relevant thing that goes with this 18-month period that we've had, because the North Node has been in Gemini, and the North Node represents the increase, and the South Node represents the decrease. So in Gemini, where it's all about these sort of like fleeting moments and variety and little, it seems like a lot. It's like an increase of a lot of things which could be like distracting or keeping us in this kind of like attention deficit disorder kind of state of mind, where we're just bouncing from one thing to the next thing without any sort of like sense of like stability underneath it. And in contrast to that, I think that Jupiter, and maybe also we can bring Saturn into the conversation, that Saturn, these slower moving planets, kind of represent the other side of that, which is this kind of like stability and persistence that we're missing. Now, the thing is that like in some way that maybe this doesn't really apply, because I'm thinking that, in the context of COVID, the COVID has introduced a different kind of a situation where I mean, I remember when it first started, I kind of had this attitude that was like, I mean, like the years seem to go by so quickly, anyways. I don't know if you guys get this too, but like sometimes life seems like a bit of a time warp. Like I first started studying astrology more seriously in 2017, and now it's almost New Year's. It's almost going to be 2022. It's like, that's 5 years. Where did all that time go? Right? And so if that amount of time can just pass by so quickly, then you know what I'm saying? There's like that sense of fleetingness that when the pandemic first started, it was kind of like, oh, even if it does last a while, life seems like it's a kind of a fleeting blur anyways. So I'm sure the pandemic will be over before we know it. But now here we are, and there might be a lot of I think a lot of astrologers might look to Jupiter and Pisces as being like the marker of more optimistic times coming up ahead. But as we are, even though, I mean, Jupiter is just 2 degrees away from Pisces right now, it is very close to going into Pisces. But as it stands, in this present moment, what we're dealing with is Jupiter in Aquarius. We're not dealing with Jupiter in Pisces. So I think there's this temptation to make this full moon all about Pisces when we're not quite there yet, right? And it's like we almost want, it's like we've gone from a period of time where because of all this sort of stimulation, and the kind of media that we're exposed to, I think we have this kind of like sense of this like life is a blur, and it's just this like fleeting rush that goes by before we can keep track of it. But in a way that I think COVID is kind of like, wouldn't it be nice if COVID was just a fleeting thing? That it was just like remember that time when we all got scared of the pandemic? Oh boy, that was crazy. And then, glad that's over. And, but it's like, it's not as fleeting as we want it to be, is it? Right. And that's because I think especially when you bring in Saturn, like Saturn is the kind of the opposite of that quality. Saturn is the sense of like, slow, dull, like I wish things would move faster, but this damn Saturnian business is just taking way too long. And like that, even that the feeling that you get when you have to like wait longer than you'd like to for something, and that there's not an entertaining thing to just make time feel like it's passing quickly. Like, the theory of relativity, when you're sitting next to somebody attractive, time's supposed to move faster than if you're not. Like, if you're just sitting at like a barren bus stand at the side of the highway and nothing around, and it's just really boring. It's like, that's more Saturnian. But that gives us more of a sense of the structure of something that's more stable, that's more solid, that isn't just going to like give way to the next thing in the blink of an eye. And I think that like there's something good that comes from that, even though we might be conditioned by the kind of culture that we're in to appreciate the sort of like hyperactive sugar rush kind of world that is more of a Gemini quality, or at least that's how I interpret it. To like just read some more kind of stuff out of this this book. He's talking about Nietzsche here. Nietzsche formulates 3 tasks for which pedagogues are necessary. A pedagogue is a kind of teacher. One needs to learn to see, to think, and to speak and write. The goal of education, according to Nietzsche, is noble culture. Learning to see means getting your eyes used to calm, to patience, to letting things come to you. That is, making yourself capable of deep and contemplative attention, casting a long and slow gaze. Such learning to see represents the first preliminary schooling for spirituality. One must learn not to react immediately to stimulus, but instead take control of the inhibiting, excluding instincts. By the same token, every characteristic of absence of spirituality, every piece of common vulgarity is due to an inability to resist a stimulus, the inability to set a no in opposition. Reacting immediately, yielding to every impulse, already amounts to illness and represents a symptom of exhaustion. Here, Nietzsche is simply speaking of the need to revitalize the vita contemplativa. The vita contemplativa is not a matter of passive affirmation and being open to whatever happens. Instead, it offers resistance to crowding, intrusive stimuli. Instead of surrendering the gaze to external impulses, it steers them in a sovereign fashion. As a mode of saying no, sovereign action proves more active than any and all hyperactivity, which represents a symptom of mental exhaustion. What eludes Arendt in the dialectic of being active is that hyperactive intensification leads to an abrupt switch into hyperpassivity. Now one obeys every impulse or stimulus without resistance. Instead of freedom, it produces new constraints. It is an illusion to believe that being more active means being freer. So, what are you saying about the ability to say no to things? I'm getting a delivery, it looks like. I'm going to, hold on, just pause it for a sec. So, anyways, if you think about, let's take it to like Sagittarius, for example, which you have the image of the archer. The whole thing about the archer is the kind of the specific point of like the, hitting the bullseye or hitting the target with the arrow, is that you're not just willy-nilly launching your arrows whatever direction, like it doesn't matter. It's like trying to hone in on that very specific landing point for the arrow, and having that kind of precision. Whereas Gemini, which represents more of a kind of a multiplicity, like I feel like there's a kind of a problem with it, that it's like the idea of being like you lack the ability to hone in on that one specific direction, and your arrows are just flying everywhere in a kind of unfocused, undirected kind of way. And so in my sense is that in this current situation where Jupiter, the ruler of Sagittarius, is still in Aquarius, it's about to leave, sure, but it's still under the influence of Saturn, that if there's anything, rather than just being kind of negative about it, seeing it as like, oh, isn't it going to be great once Jupiter is in Pisces and it's out of the influence of this, slow, dull, kind of boring Saturn influence, that we can actually look at the current astrological influences that are here right now, and see the actual gifts, I guess you could say, that Saturn is giving us. One of those which would be to refine and kind of focus in on things, which necessarily involves a rejection or a saying no to all these other things which might be competing for our attention, so that we can focus and kind of concentrate our awareness into a certain direction, rather than it being like going on Facebook and just kind of like, oh, Where did the last hour go? I don't know. I've just been like mindlessly looking at memes and just following whatever kind of catches my fancy, right? Like that's, I kind of feel like Gemini has the risk of like being a bit like that it's just sort of like the, what you associate with attention deficit disorder, basically, whereas like there's nothing, you don't really have the kind of quality of sticking with it long enough to get something worthwhile out of what you're doing, because your attention is too weak that it just gets carried off in whatever random direction, that you need to be actually have the strength to sort of like say no, and to be, and what Byung-Chul Han calls sovereignty is like you've got the sovereignty to be like, I'm not just going to go along with whatever suggested video comes up. You know what I mean? Like I'm not just going to have these algorithms dragging my attention off here and there and everywhere, that I actually have some of my own sovereignty in determining what I'm going to do with my attention, what I'm going to do with my energy, what I'm going to do with my awareness. Whereas when you're at a weakened state, your ability to say no is actually weakened. And I mean, I'm not going to get into it all right now, but in this book, he talks about how there's a difference between negative potency and just like an absence of positivity, which is like, there's a difference between like, if your friends are like, you know, like if your friends come by and ask if you want to go out to the bar to have a few beers, you know, you could say like, you could say no because like I'm too tired for it right now. I really don't have the energy, or I don't have enough money. And these are all because you're lacking, you couldn't do it if you wanted to. You're lacking the ability to say yes. But what he describes as a negative potency is that like, your friends come to the door. I mean, you know, you could use those things as excuses, I guess, but I'm talking about your true reason for saying yes or saying no. The friends come to the door and ask if you want to like have a beer with them or whatever, and you say no, I'm not drinking anymore. I'm not doing that, right? And it's not because you wouldn't. There's nothing stopping you from doing it except for your own will and motivation to stop yourself. And you know, it might even be that it may be actually enticing. That maybe you're like, oh man, that looks like it could be fun, but your own kind of strength of will and motivation is strong enough to or have that sovereignty to make your own choices and go in a different direction. Whereas if you don't have that sovereignty, if you don't have that what we call negative potency, then you know, you don't have the strength to say no, but it's not really a positive yes. You just don't have the strength to put up any resistance to it. And I think that it's like a good one for the spiritual community, because there's a lot of stuff that may have some degree of truth to it, but it becomes a kind of a platitude. Like, there's the whole Carl Jung thing about what resists persists, right? And so there's a sort of advice that people give is like, don't resist anything. Don't even resist resistance itself. I don't know if you've heard that one, right? But, you know, there's the kind of thing is like, what's necessarily wrong about persisting, right? And it kind of leads into the point that Byung-Chul Han is making, that it's like, if you don't have any resistance at all, you can actually have problems in the other direction, which is like, sure, yeah, what resists persists. So let's get rid of resistance entirely, and just what you end up with is this fleeting, transitory world where everything just rushes by in a blur of, you know, happy face emojis and, you know, positive. But you're like, you kind of feels a bit like cheap, like you didn't really get anything out of it. Like it's just this kind of like superficial, fleeting nothing, right? You don't actually get a sense of that something solid to really put your feet down on. That in order to get that actually negativity, being able to resist and for things to persist, gives us more of a sense of something of a duration of a world that isn't so fleeting and temporary and transient, and we actually have something that that we can kind of stay with for a more of a kind of a prolonged time and maybe get something out of, right? Rather than just, it's kind of like something that maybe is of a better nutrient value than the fleetingness, which kind of feels to me like empty calories, if you want to use that as a as an example. Um, so, anyways, to kind of summarize, I guess where I'm going with this full moon interpretation is that it marks the end of an 18-month period where the the North Node representing increase has been in Gemini, representing an increase of what I kind of take to be the sort of fleeting, transitory, almost kind of like ADHD kind of awareness. Meanwhile, the South Node has been in Sagittarius, kind of giving a kind of a loss of that kind of, honing in on the target of what the truth really is. And I think, I mean, at least to me, I mean, I think it sort of gives a sense of, it could give a sense of sort of like a spiritual impoverishment almost in a way, because it's like, rather than meditating or something like that, just like flicking channels on the TV or just being, losing the signal to a whole bunch of noise. And but at the same time, I think that we can look ahead and see that Jupiter is about to go into Pisces very quickly, and we can look ahead to all this stuff that could come from Jupiter and Pisces, and we could look ahead to the nodes being in Taurus and Scorpio, and just to some extent, maybe that's what people look to astrologers for, is to look ahead and get some idea of what's coming next. But the way I'm kind of like working with this full moon is that, I mean, before I ever got into astrology, I was into meditation. And the whole point of meditation is being present with whatever is arising. And that when you start to anticipate too much, or you start to lean into the future a bit too much, it's like you start to miss out on the present moment. And that's where everything's happening. That the future is not manifest, that that we experience life moment by moment in the present. And I kind of feel like there's this desire to just get it over with, to be like, can we get out of this Jupiter Saturn phase that we've been going through this whole like they had the grand conjunction, what was it, last year, the Jupiter and Saturn, the grand conjunction you could see in the sky, and I think we're all like eager to just get on to the next thing. But I think that's kind of, that might help to kind of watch that, because it's sort of like there's a kind of a problem when we're too eager to just like, let's get on to the next thing, because we're never fully taking in what is actually here right now, right? We're always like wanting to just like blitz through life in a kind of a blur so we can just kind of like bypass all the things which might seem more negative and uncomfortable. But it's like that kind of negativity, which is not just one thing after, when it's all positive, it's just one thing after another, no resistance, just like, you know what I mean? And that's with having the Saturnian grind. I think it's like, it's like a good opportunity to bring awareness to something. And it's like every time it's like having a long meditation and you're looking at your watch, like, when's this good? Like, that's kind of what I kind of feel like this sort of like phase has been over. And my attitude to get through this kind of stuff is to, rather than rather than to look forward to whatever is coming next, is to realize that in some way it's not going to be any better than what is right here right now. You know what I mean? That if you think that what's going to come later is better than what's here now, then you're always kind of you're never really getting what's actually here, right? I mean, this could just be some Eckhart Tolle kind of 101 stuff. Maybe I don't need to spend too much time on it. um I mean, I was in the hospital recently, and I think that I noticed that this kind of stuff helped for that experience, because I was in the hospital for 5 weeks. I mean, so but some would say that's a long stay. There's a guy that I shared a room with that was in there for even longer. He had a much more serious condition. Um, but like, that I managed to get through that by not trying to think like, oh, I wonder when I'm gonna be back at home, or I wonder when I'm gonna be out of this experience. I wonder when this will end and I'll get to do something more comfortable or more pleasurable. It's like to just be there with what's going on, and not, not having that experience defined by wanting to just get on to the next thing, and just basically embracing whatever is there. And also I mean, and in that, sort of recognize that the force of Saturn, which we could say is like having this effect of slowing things down, feeling like things are kind of a drag, that it's actually even though we consider it to be the greater malefic, that it's actually in some way of a benefit to us. If only we can see that it is a benefit, then only that we can see that there is a benefit to saying no to things sometimes, or to not getting everything that you want, or not having everything go your way, or have basically that whole thing that resistance is not always bad, that actually to be able to have a bit of resistance is actually necessary to give a sense of not having everything constantly just slipping out from underneath you. That it's like you actually have a sense of something, a solid and stable reality that you have to deal with. That you actually have to be, that you're actually have a chance to pay attention to it in a more prolonged way, and then you can get contemplation happening, basically. And that's, I think, and that's, what Sagittarius is all about, is the kind of philosophical higher truths that will only come from if you have a chance to have these longer periods of contemplation, that you can really just sort of sit with something for a long time, rather than having to like churn out like a short tweet, like like the world of Twitter and all this sort of and I think if you can maybe understand why personally I don't do astrology on the format of TikTok, right? I guess I suppose recently I've been doing videos that are more like 20 minutes or half an hour or something, but I prefer to do something that demands a longer, more sustained kind of attention, because I can see the value in that, and I don't want my own, my own energy to just contribute to this sort of like world where nobody has an attention span anymore, where there's an attitude of this hyperactivity, where everybody's kind of neurotically running around all worked up because nobody can slow down and just sort of sit with things, right? I mean, I've basically, and it's like, I don't know, in some way, I don't want to just say like be a guy that like say that I'm making this video my like soapbox for meditation, because I think, I mean, you can make it about meditating if you want to, but I think it's like, in a way, it's even bigger than that. It's like, but yeah, okay, this is my video for the full moon anyways. Hopefully you like it. I don't know. If you don't, that's okay. But whatever. Hit like and subscribe if you do.